This is a continuation of The Beetle by Richard Marsh, comprising chapters 28 through 31.
Chapter 28. The Strange Story of the Man in the Street. I have been anticipating for some weeks past that things would become exciting, and they have, but hardly in the way which I foresaw. It is the old story of the unexpected happening. Suddenly events of the most extraordinary nature have come crowding on me from the most unlooked-for quarters. Let me try to take them in something like their proper order. To begin with, Sydney has behaved very badly, so badly that it seems likely that I shall have to recast my whole conception of his character. It was nearly 9 o'clock this morning when I cannot say woke up, because I do not believe that I had really been asleep, but when I returned to consciousness, I found myself sitting up in bed, trembling like some frightened child. What had actually happened to me I did not know, could not guess. I was conscious of an overwhelming sense of nausea, and generally I was feeling very far from well. I endeavoured to arrange my thoughts and to decide upon some plan of action. Finally, I decided to go for advice and help where I had so often gone before, to Sidney Atherton. I went to him. I told him the whole gruesome story. He saw he could not help but see what a deep impress the events of the night had made on me. He heard me to the end with every appearance of sympathy, and then all at once I discovered that all the time Papa had been concealed behind a large screen which was in the room, listening to every word I had been uttering. That I was dumbfounded goes without saying. It was bad enough in Papa, but in Sydney it seemed, and it was, such treachery. He and I have told each other secrets all our lives. It has never entered my imagination, as he very well knows, to play him false, in one jot or tittle, and I have always understood that, in this sort of matter, men pride themselves on their sense of honour being so much keener than women's. I told them some plain truths, and I fancy that I left them both feeling heartily ashamed of themselves. One result the experience had on me: it wound me up. It had on me the revivifying effect of a cold douche. I realised that mine was a situation in which I should have to help myself. When I returned home I learned that the man whom I had found in the street was himself again, and was as conscious as he was ever likely to be, burning with curiosity to learn the nature of the connection which existed between Paul and him, and what was the meaning of his oracular apostrophes. I merely paused to remove my hat before hastening into his apartment. When he saw me, and heard who I was, the expressions of his gratitude were painful in their intensity. The tears streamed down his cheeks. He looked to me like a man who had very little life left in him. He looked weak, and white, and worn to a shadow. Probably he never had been robust, and it was only too plain that privation had robbed him of what little strength he had ever had. He was nothing else but skin and bone. Physical and mental debility was written large all over him. He was not bad-looking, in a milk and watery sort of way. He had pale blue eyes and very fair hair, and I dare say, at one time, had been a spruce enough clerk. It was difficult to guess his age. One ages so rapidly under the stress of misfortune, but I should have set him down as being about 40. His voice, though faint enough at first, was that of an educated man, and as he went on, and gathered courage, and became more and more in earnest, he spoke with a simple directness which was close akin to eloquence. It was a curious story which he had to tell. So curious, so astounding indeed, that by the time it was finished, I was in such a state of mind that I could perceive no alternative but to forgive Sydney, and, in spite of his recent and scandalous misbehaviour, again appealed to him for assistance. It seemed, if the story told by the man whom I had found in the street was true, and incredible though it sounded, he spoke like a truthful man, that Paul was threatened by some dreadful, and, to me, wholly incomprehensible danger, that it was a case in which even moments were precious, and I felt that, with the best will in the world, it was a position in which I could not move alone. The shadow of the terror of the night was with me still, and with that fresh in my recollection, how could I hope, single-handed, to act effectually against the mysterious being of whom this amazing tale was told? No! I believed that Sydney did care for me, in his own peculiar way. I knew that he was quick and cool, and fertile in resource, and that he showed to most advantage in a difficult situation. It was possible that he had a conscience of a sort, and that, this time, I might not appeal to it in vain. So I sent a servant off to fetch him, helter-skelter. As luck would have it, the servant returned with him within 5 minutes. It appeared that he had been lunching with Dora Grayling, who lives just at the end of the street, and the footman had met him coming down the steps. I had him shown into my own room. I want you to go to the man whom I found in the street, and listen to what he has to say. With pleasure. Can I trust you? To listen to what he has to say? I believe so. Can I trust you to respect my confidence?" He was not at all abashed. I never saw Sidney Atherton when he was abashed. Whatever the offence of which he has been guilty, he always seems completely at his ease. His eyes twinkled. "You can, I will not breathe a syllable even to paper." "In that case, come. But you understand, I am going to put to the test the affirmations which you have made during all these years, and to prove if you have any of the feeling for me which you pretend." Directly we were in the stranger's room, Sidney marched straight up to the bed, stared at the man who was lying in it, crammed his hands into his trouser pockets, and whistled. I was amazed. "So," he exclaimed, "it's you." "Do you know this man?" I asked. I am hardly prepared to go so far as to say that I know him, but I chance to have a memory for faces, and it happens that I have met this gentleman on at least one previous occasion. Perhaps he remembers me. "Do you?" The stranger seemed uneasy, as if he found Sidney's tone and manner disconcerting. "I do. You are the man in the street." "Precisely." "I am that individual." "And you are the man who came through the window, and in a much more comfortable condition you appear to be than when first I saw you." Sidney turned to me. "It is just possible, Miss Linden, that I may have a few remarks to make to this gentleman which would be better made in private, if you don't mind." "But I do mind, I mind very much. What do you suppose I sent for you here for?" Sidney smiled that absurd, provoking smile of his, as if the occasion were not sufficiently serious. "To show that you still repose in me a vestige of your confidence." "Don't talk nonsense. This man has told me a most extraordinary story, and I have sent for you as you may believe, not too willingly." Sidney bowed in order that he may repeat it in your presence, and in mine. "Is that so? Well, permit me to offer you a chair. This tale may turn out to be a trifle long." To humour him, I accepted the chair he offered. Though I should have preferred to stand, he seated himself on the side of the bed, fixing on the stranger those keen, quizzical, not too merciful eyes of his. "Well, sir, we are at your service, if you will be so good as to favour us with a second edition of that pleasant yarn you have been spinning, but let us begin at the right end. What's your name?" "My name is Robert Holt." "That's so?" "Then, Mr. Robert Holt, let her go." Thus encouraged, Mr. Holt repeated the tale which he had told me, only in more connected fashion than before. I fancy that Sidney's glances exercised on him a sort of hypnotic effect, and this kept him to the point. He scarcely needed a word of prompting from the first syllable to the last. He told how, tired, wet, hungry, desperate, despairing, he had been refused admittance to the casual ward, that unfailing resource, as one would have supposed, of those who had abandoned even hope. How he had come upon an open window in an apparently empty house, and, thinking of nothing but shelter from the inclement night, he had clambered through it. How he had found himself in the presence of an extraordinary being, who, in his debilitated and nervous state, had seemed to him to be only half human. How this dreadful creature had given utterance to wild sentiments of hatred towards Paul Lessingham, my Paul. How he had taken advantage of Holt's enfeebled state to gain over him the most complete, horrible, and, indeed, almost incredible ascendancy. How he actually had sent Holt, practically naked, into the storm-driven streets to commit burglary at Paul's house, and how he, Holt, had actually gone without being able to offer even a shadow of opposition. How Paul, suddenly returning home, had come upon Holt engaged in the very act of committing burglary, and how, on his hearing Holt make a cabalistic reference to some mysterious Beetle, the manhood had gone out of him, and he had suffered the intruder to make good his escape without an effort to detain him. The story had seemed sufficiently astonishing the first time. It seemed still more astonishing the second. But as I watched Sidney listening, what struck me chiefly was the conviction that he had heard it all before. I charged him with it directly Holt had finished. "This is not the first time you have been told this tale." "Pardon me, but it is. Do you suppose I live in an atmosphere of fairy tales?" Something in his manner made me feel sure he was deceiving me. "Sidney, don't tell me a story. Paul has told you." "I am not telling you a story, at least on this occasion, and Mr. Lessingham has not told me. Suppose we postpone these details to a little later, and perhaps, in the interim, you will permit me to put a question or two to Mr. Holt." I let him have his way, though I knew he was concealing something from me, that he had a more intimate acquaintance with Mr. Holt's strange tale than he chose to confess, and, for some cause, his reticence annoyed me. He looked at Mr. Holt in silence for a second or two. Then he said, with the quizzical little air of bland impertinence which is peculiarly his own, "I presume, Mr. Holt, you have been entertaining us with a novelty in fables, and that we are not expected to believe this pleasant little yarn of yours." I expect nothing. But I have told you the truth, and you know it. This seemed to take Sydney aback. I protest that, like Miss Linden, you credit me with a more extensive knowledge than I possess. However, we will let that pass. I take it that you paid particular attention to this mysterious habitant of this mysterious dwelling. I saw that Mr. Holt shuddered. I am not likely ever to forget him. Then, in that case, you will be able to describe him to us. To do so adequately would be beyond my powers, but I will do my best. If the original was more remarkable than the description which he gave of him, then he must have been remarkable indeed. The impression conveyed to my mind was rather of a monster than a human being. I watched Sydney attentively as he followed Mr. Holt's somewhat lurid language, and there was something in his demeanour which made me more and more persuaded that he was more behind the scenes in this strange Haines than he pretended, or than the speaker suspected. He put a question which seemed uncalled for by anything which Mr. Holt had said. "You are sure this thing of beauty was a man?" "No, sir. That is exactly what I am not sure." There was a note in Sydney's voice which suggested that he had received precisely the answer which he had expected. "Did you think it was a woman?" "I did think so more than once, though I can hardly explain what made me think so. There was certainly nothing womanly about the face." He paused, as if to reflect, then added, "I suppose it was a question of instinct." "I see. Just so. It occurs to me, Mr. Holt, that you are rather strong on questions of instinct. Sydney got our veins." He stretched himself, as if fatigued, which is a way he has. "I will not do you the injustice to hint that I do not believe a word of your charming and simple narrative. On the contrary, I will demonstrate my perfect credence by remarking that I have not the slightest doubt that you will be able to point out to me, for my particular satisfaction, the delightful residence on which the whole is founded." Mr. Holt coloured. Sydney's tone could scarcely have been more significant. "You must remember, sir, that it was a dark night, that I had never been in that neighbourhood before, and that I was not in a condition to pay much attention to locality. All of which is granted, but how far was it from Hammersmith Workhouse? Possibly under half a mile. Then, in that case, surely you can remember which turning you took on leaving Hammersmith Workhouse. I suppose there are not many turnings you could have taken." "I think I could remember." "Then you shall have an opportunity to try. It isn't a very far cry to Hammersmith. Don't you think you are well enough to drive there now, just you and I together in a cab?" "I should say so. I wish to get up this morning. It is by the doctor's orders I have stayed in bed." "Then, for once in a while, the doctor's orders shall be ignored. I prescribe fresh air." Sydney turned to me. "Since Mr. Holt's wardrobe seems rather to seek, don't you think a suit of one of the men might fit him, if Mr. Holt wouldn't mind making shift for the moment? Then, by the time you've finished dressing Mr. Holt, I shall be ready." While they were ascertaining which suit of clothes would be best adapted to his figure, I went with Sydney to my room. So soon as we were in, I let him know that this was not a matter in which I intended to be trifled with. "Of course you understand, Sydney, that I am coming with you?" He pretended not to know what I meant. "Coming with me? I am delighted to hear it, but where?" "To the house of which Mr. Holt has been speaking. Nothing could give me greater pleasure, but might I point out, Mr. Holt has to find it yet. I will come to help you to help him find it." Sydney laughed, but I could see he did not altogether relish the suggestion. 3. In a hansom. "There is such a thing as a four-wheeled cab, or I could order a carriage if you'd like one." Sydney looked at me out of the corners of his eyes, then began to walk up and down the room, with his hands in his trouser pockets. Presently he began to talk nonsense. "I need not say with what a sensation of joy I should anticipate the delights of a drive with you, even in a four-wheeled cab, but, were I in your place, I fancy that I should allow Holt and your humble servant to go hunting out this house of his alone. It may prove a more tedious business than you imagine. I promise that, after the hunt is over, I will describe the proceedings to you with the most literal accuracy. I dare say. Do you think I don't know you've been deceiving me all the time?" "Deceiving you?" "I?" "Yes, you. Do you think I'm quite an idiot?" "My dear Marjorie, do you think I can't see that you know all about what Mr. Holt has been telling us, perhaps more about it than he knows himself? On my word, with what an amount of knowledge you do credit me. Yes, I do, or discredit you, rather. If I were to trust you, you would tell me just as much as you chose, which would be nothing. I'm coming with you, so there's an end." "Very well. Do you happen to know if there are any revolvers in the house?" "Revolvers? Whatever for?" because I should like to borrow one. I will not conceal from you, since you press me, that this is a case in which a revolver is quite likely to be required. You are trying to frighten me. I am doing nothing of the kind, only, under the circumstances, I am bound to point out to you what it is you may expect. Oh, you think that you're bound to point that out? Do you, then, now your bounden duty's done? As for there being any revolvers in the house, Papa has a perfect arsenal. Would you like to take them all? Thanks, but I dare say I shall be able to manage with one. Unless you would like one too, you may find yourself in need of it. I am obliged to you, but on this occasion I don't think I'll trouble. I'll run the risk. Oh, Sydney, what a hypocrite you are. It's for your sake, if I seem to be, I tell you most seriously, that I earnestly advise you to allow Mr. Holt and I to manage this affair alone. I don't mind going so far as to say that this is a matter with which, in days to come, you will wish that you had not allowed yourself to be associated. What do you mean by that? Do you dare to insinuate anything against Paul? I insinuate nothing. What I mean, I say right out. And my dear Marjorie, what I actually do mean is this, that if, in spite of my urgent solicitations, you will persist in accompanying us, the expedition, so far as I am concerned, will be postponed. That is what you do mean, is it? Then, that's settled. I rang the bell. The servant came. Order a 4-wheeled cab at once. And let me know the moment Mr. Holt is ready. The servant went. I turned to Sydney. If you will excuse me, I will go and put my hat on. You are, of course, at liberty to please yourself as to whether you will or will not go, but if you don't, then I shall go with Mr. Holt alone. I moved to the door. He stopped me. My dear Marjorie, why will you persist in treating me with such injustice? Believe me, you have no idea what sort of adventure this is which you are setting out upon, or you would hear reason. I assure you that you are gratuitously proposing to thrust yourself into imminent peril. What sort of peril? Why do you beat about the bush? Why don't you speak right out? I can't speak right out. There are circumstances which render it practically impossible, and that's the plain truth. But the danger is none the less real on that account. I am not jesting. I am in earnest. Won't you take my word for it? It is not a question of taking your word only. It is a question of something else beside. I have not forgotten my adventures of last night, and Mr. Holt's story is mysterious enough in itself, but there is something more mysterious still at the back of it, something which you appear to suggest points unpleasantly at Paul. My duty is clear, and nothing you can say will turn me from it. Paul, as you are very well aware, is already overweighted with affairs of state, pretty nearly borne down by them, or I would take the tale to him, and he would talk to you after a fashion of his own. Things being as they are, I propose to show you that, although I am not yet Paul's wife, I can make his interests my own as completely as though I were. I can therefore only repeat that it is for you to decide what you intend to do, but if you prefer to stay, I shall go with Mr. Holt, alone. Understand that, when the time for regret comes, as it will come, you are not to blame me for having done what I advised you not to do. My dear Mr. Atherton, I will undertake to do my utmost to guard your spotless reputation. I should be sorry that anyone should hold you responsible for anything I either said or did. Very well. Your blood be on your own head. My blood. Yes, your blood. I shouldn't be surprised if it comes to blood before we're through. Perhaps you'll oblige me with the loan of one of that arsenal of revolvers of which you spoke. I let him have his old revolver. Or rather, I let him have one of Papa's new ones. He put it in the hip pocket in his trousers, and the expedition started in a 4-wheeled cab. Chapter 29. The house on the road from the workhouse. Mr. Holt looked as if he was in somebody else's garments. He was so thin and worn and wasted that the suit of clothes which one of the men had lent him hung upon him as on a scarecrow. I was almost ashamed of myself for having incurred a share of the responsibility of taking him out of bed. He seemed so weak and bloodless that I should not have been surprised if he had fainted on the road. I had taken care that he should eat as much as he could eat before we started. The suggestion of starvation which he had conveyed to one's mind was dreadful, and I had brought a flask of brandy in case of accidents. But in spite of everything, I could not conceal from myself that he would be more at home in a sick bed than in a jolting cab. It was not a cheerful drive. There was in Sydney's manner towards me an air of protection which I instinctively resented. He appeared to be regarding me as a careful and anxious nurse might regard a wrong-headed and disobedient child. Conversation distinctly languished. Since Sydney seemed disposed to patronize me, I was bent on snubbing him. The result was that the majority of the remarks which were uttered were addressed to Mr. Holt. The cab stopped. After what had appeared to me to be an interminable journey, I was rejoiced at the prospect of its being at an end. Sidney put his head out of the window. A short parley with the driver ensued. "This is Hammersmith Workhouse. It's a large place, sir. Which part of it might you be wanting?" Sidney appealed to Mr. Holt. He put his head out of the window in his turn. He did not seem to recognise our surroundings at all. "We have come a different way. This is not the way I went. I went through Hammersmith. And to the casual ward. I don't see that here." Sidney spoke to the cabman. "Driver, where's the casual ward?" "That's the other end, sir." "Then take us there." He took us there. Then Sidney appealed again to Mr. Holt. "Shall I dismiss the cabman? Or don't you feel equal to walking?" "Thank you. I feel quite equal to walking. I think the exercise will do me good." So the cabman was dismissed, a step which we and I, in particular, had subsequent cause to regret. Mr. Holt took his bearings. He pointed to a door which was just in front of us. "That's the entrance to the casual ward, and that, over it, is the window through which the other man threw a stone." I went to the right. Back the way I had come, we went to the right. I reached this corner, we had reached a corner. Mr. Holt looked about him, endeavouring to recall the way he had gone. A good many roads appeared to converge at that point, so that he might have wandered in either of several directions. Presently he arrived at something like a decision. "I think this is the way I went. I am nearly sure it is." He led the way, with something of an air of dubitation, and we followed. The road he had chosen seemed to lead to nothing, and nowhere. We had not gone many yards from the workhouse gates before we were confronted by something like chaos. In front and on either side of us were large spaces of waste land. At some more or less remote period, attempts appeared to have been made at brickmaking. There were untidy stacks of bilious-looking bricks in evidence. Here and there enormous weather-stained boards announced that this desirable land was to be let for building purposes. The road itself was unfinished. There was no pavement, and we had the bare, uneven ground for sidewalk. It seemed, so far as I could judge, to lose itself in space, and to be swallowed up by the wilderness of desirable land which lay beyond. In the near distance there were houses enough, and to spare of a kind, but they were in other roads. In the one in which we actually were, on the right, at the end, there was a row of unfurnished carcasses, but only 2 buildings which were in anything like a fit state for occupation. One stood on either side, not facing each other. There was a distance between them of perhaps 50 yards. The sight of them had a more exciting effect on Mr. Holt than it had on me. He moved rapidly forward, coming to a standstill in front of the one upon our left, which was the nearer of the pair. "This is the house," he exclaimed. He seemed almost exhilarated. I confess that I was depressed. A more dismal-looking habitation one could hardly imagine. It was one of those dreadful jerry-built houses which, while they are still new, look old. It had quite possibly only been built a year or two, and yet, owing to neglect, or to poverty of construction, or to a combination of the two, it was already threatening to tumble down. It was a small place, a couple of stories high, and would have been dear, I should think, at £30 a year. The windows had surely never been washed since the house was built. Those on the upper floor seemed all either cracked or broken. The only sign of occupancy consisted in the fact that a blind was down behind the window of the room on the ground floor. Curtains there were none. A low wall ran in front, which had apparently at one time been surmounted by something in the shape of an iron railing. A rusty piece of metal still remained on one end, but since there was only about a foot between it and the building, which was practically built upon the road, whether the wall was intended to ensure privacy, or was merely for ornament, was not clear. "This is the house," repeated Mr. Holt, showing more signs of life than I had hitherto seen in him. Sidney looked it up and down. It apparently appealed to his aesthetic sense as little as it did to mine. "Are you sure?" "I am certain. It seems empty." "It seemed empty to me that night. That is why I got into it in search of shelter." "Which is the window which served you as a door?" "This one." Mr. Holt pointed to the window on the ground floor, the one which was screened by a blind. There was no sign of a blind when I first saw it, and the sash was up. It was that which caught my eye. Once more Sidney surveyed the place in comprehensive fashion, from roof to basement. Then he scrutinizingly regarded Mr. Holt. "You are quite sure this is the house? It might be awkward if you proved mistaken. I am going to knock at the door, and if it turns out that that mysterious acquaintance of yours does not, and never has lived here, we might find an explanation difficult. I am sure it is the house. Certain. I know it. I feel it here. And here." Mr. Holt touched his breast and his forehead. His manner was distinctly odd. He was trembling, and a fevered expression had come into his eyes. Sidney glanced at him, for a moment, in silence, then he bestowed his attention upon me. "May I ask if I may rely upon your preserving your presence of mind?" The mere question ruffled my plumes. "What do you mean?" "What I say. I am going to knock at that door, and I am going to get through it, somehow. It is quite within the range of possibility that, when I am through, there will be some strange happenings. As you have heard from Mr. Holt, the house is commonplace enough without. You may not find it so commonplace within. You may find yourself in a position in which it will be in the highest degree essential that you should keep your wits about you. I am not likely to let them stray." "Then that's all right. Do I understand that you propose to come in with me?" "Of course I do. What do you suppose I've come for? What nonsense you are talking." "I hope that you will still continue to consider it nonsense by the time this little adventure's done." That I resented his impertinence goes without saying. To be talked to in such a strain by Sidney Atherton, whom I had kept in subjection ever since he was in knickerbockers, was a little trying, but I am forced to admit that I was more impressed by his manner, or his words, or by Mr. Holt's manner, or something, than I should have cared to own. I had not the least notion what was going to happen, or what horrors that woebegone-looking dwelling contained, but Mr. Holt's story had been of the most astonishing sort. My experiences of the previous night were still fresh, and, altogether, now that I was in such close neighbourhood with the unknown with a capital U, although it was broad daylight, it loomed before me in a shape for which, candidly, I was not prepared. A more disreputable-looking front door I have not seen. It was in perfect harmony with the remainder of the establishment. The paint was off, the woodwork was scratched and dented, the knocker was red with rust. When Sidney took it in his hand, I was conscious of quite a little thrill. As he brought it down with a sharp rat-tat, I half expected to see the door fly open and disclose some gruesome object glaring out at us. Nothing of the kind took place. The door did not budge, nothing happened. Sidney waited a second or two, then knocked again, another second or two, then another knock. There was still no sign of any notice being taken of our presence. Sidney turned to Mr. Holt. "Seems as if the place was empty." Mr. Holt was in the most singular condition of agitation. It made me uncomfortable to look at him. "You do not know, you cannot tell. There may be someone there who hears and pays no heed. I'll give them another chance." Sidney brought down the knocker with thundering reverberations. The din must have been audible half a mile away, but from within the house there was still no sign that any heard. Sidney came down the step. "I'll try another way. I may have better fortune at the back." He led the way round to the rear, Mr. Holt and I following in single file. There the place seemed in worse case even than in the front. There were 2 empty rooms on the ground floor at the back. There was no mistake about their being empty. Without the slightest difficulty we could see right into them. One was apparently intended for a kitchen and wash-house combined, the other for a sitting room. There was not a stick of furniture in either, nor the slightest sign of human habitation. Sidney commented on the fact. "Not only is it plain that no one lives in these charming apartments, but it looks to me uncommonly as if no one ever had lived in them." To my thinking, Mr. Holt's agitation was increasing every moment. For some reason of his own, Sidney took no notice of it whatever, possibly because he judged that to do so would only tend to make it worse. An odd change had even taken place in Mr. Holt's voice. He spoke in a sort of tremulous falsetto. "It was only the front room which I saw." "Very good. Then, before very long, you shall see that front room again." Sidney rapped with his knuckles on the glass panels of the back door. He tried the handle. When it refused to yield, he gave it a vigorous shaking. He saluted the dirty windows, so far as succeeding in attracting attention was concerned, entirely in vain. Then he turned again to Mr. Holt, half mockingly. "I call you to witness that I have used every lawful means to gain the favourable notice of your mysterious friend. I must therefore beg to stand excused if I try something slightly unlawful for a change. It is true that you found the window already open, but in my case it soon will be." He took a knife out of his pocket, and, with the open blade, forced back the catch as I am told that burglars do. Then he lifted the sash. "Behold," he exclaimed. "What did I tell you? Now, my dear Marjorie, if I get in first and Mr. Holt gets in after me, we shall be in a position to open the door for you." I immediately saw through his design. "No, Mr. Atherton, you will get in first, and I will get in after you, through the window, before Mr. Holt. I don't intend to wait for you to open the door." Sidney raised his hands and opened his eyes, as if grieved at my want of confidence. But I did not mean to be left in the lurch, to wait their pleasure, while on pretence of opening the door, they searched the house. So Sidney climbed in first, and I second. It was not a difficult operation. since the window sill was under 3 feet from the ground and Mr. Holt last. Directly we were in, Sidney put his hand up to his mouth and shouted, "Is there anybody in this house? If so, will he kindly step this way, as there is someone wishes to see him?" His words went echoing through the empty rooms in a way which was almost uncanny. I suddenly realized that if, after all, there did happen to be somebody in the house, and he was at all disagreeable, our presence on his premises might prove rather difficult to explain. However, no one answered. While I was waiting for Sidney to make the next move, he diverted my attention to Mr. Holt. "Hollow, Holt, what's the matter with you? Man, don't play the fool like that." Something was the matter with Mr. Holt. He was trembling all over as if attacked by a shaking palsy. Every muscle in his body seemed twitching at once. A strained look had come on his face, which was not nice to see. He spoke as with an effort. "I'm all right." "It's nothing." "Oh, is it nothing? Then perhaps you'll drop it. Where's that brandy?" I handed Sidney the flask. "Here, swallow this." Mr. Holt swallowed the cupful of neat spirit which Sidney offered without an attempt at parley. Beyond bringing some remnants of colour to his ashen cheeks, it seemed to have no effect on him whatever. Sidney eyed him with a meaning in his glance which I was at a loss to understand. "Listen to me, my lad. Don't think you can deceive me by playing any of your fool tricks, and don't delude yourself into supposing that I shall treat you as anything but dangerous if you do. I've got this." He showed the revolver of Papa's which I had lent him. "Don't imagine that Miss Linden's presence will deter me from using it." Why he addressed Mr. Holt in such a strain surpassed my comprehension. Mr. Holt, however, evinced not the faintest symptoms of resentment. He had become, on a sudden, more like an automaton than a man. Sidney continued to gaze at him as if he would have liked his glance to penetrate to his inmost soul. "Keep in front of me, if you please, Mr. Holt, and lead the way to this mysterious apartment in which you claim to have had such a remarkable experience." Of me he asked in a whisper, "Did you bring a revolver?" I was startled. "A revolver? The idea. How absurd you are." Sidney said something which was so rude and so uncalled for that it was worthy of Papa in his most violent moments. I'd sooner be absurd than a fool in petticoats. I was so angry that I did not know what to say, and before I could say it, he went on. "Keep your eyes and ears well open. Be surprised at nothing you see or hear. Stick close to me, and for goodness sake remain mistress of as many of your senses as you conveniently can." I had not the least idea what was the meaning of it all. To me there seemed nothing to make such a pother about, and yet I was conscious of a fluttering of the heart, as if there soon might be something. I knew Sidney sufficiently well to be aware that he was one of the last men in the world to make a fuss without reason, and that he was as little likely to suppose that there was a reason when as a matter of fact there was none. Mr. Holt led the way, as Sidney desired, or rather commanded, to the door of the room which was in front of the house. The door was closed. Sidney tapped on a panel. All was silence. He tapped again. "Anyone in there?" he demanded. As there was still no answer, he tried the handle. The door was locked. The first sign of the presence of a human being we have had. Doors don't lock themselves. It's just possible that there may have been someone or something about the place, at some time or other after all. Grasping the handle firmly, he shook it with all his might, as he had done with the door at the back. So flimsily was the place constructed that he made even the walls to tremble. "Within there. If anyone is in there, if you don't open this door, I shall." There was no response. "So be it. I'm going to pursue my wild career of defiance of established law and order, and gain admission in one way, if I can't in another." Putting his right shoulder against the door, he pushed with his whole force. Sidney is a big man, and very strong, and the door was weak. Shortly, the lock yielded before the continuous pressure, and the door flew open. Sidney whistled. "So, it begins to occur to me, Mr. Holt, that story of yours may not have been such pure romance as it seemed. It was plain enough that, at any rate, this room had been occupied, and that recently, and if his taste in furniture could be taken as a test, by an eccentric occupant to boot. My own first impression was that there was someone or something living in it still. An uncomfortable odour greeted our nostrils, which was suggestive of some evil-smelling animal. Sidney seemed to share my thought. "A pretty perfume, on my word. Let's shed a little more light on the subject, and see what causes it. Marjorie, stop where you are until I tell you." I had noticed nothing, from without, peculiar about the appearance of the blind which screened the window, but it must have been made of some unusually thick material, for within, the room was strangely dark. Sidney entered, with the intention of drawing up the blind, but he had scarcely taken a couple of steps when he stopped. "What's that?" It said Mr. Holt, in a voice which was so unlike his own that it was scarcely recognizable. It. What do you mean by it? The Beetle. Oi. Judging from the sound of his voice, Sydney was all at once in a state of odd excitement. Oh, is it? Then, if this time I don't find out the how and the why and the wherefore of that charming conjuring trick, I'll give you leave to write me down an ass, with a great, big A. He rushed farther into the room. Apparently his efforts to lighten it did not meet with the immediate success which he desired. What's the matter with this confounded blind? There's no cord. How do you pull it up? What the? In the middle of his sentence, Sydney ceased speaking. Suddenly Mr. Holt, who was standing by my side on the threshold of the door, was seized with such a fit of trembling that, fearing he was going to fall, I caught him by the arm. A most extraordinary look was on his face. His eyes were distended to their fullest width, as if with horror at what they saw in front of them. Great beads of perspiration were on his forehead. It's coming, he screamed. Exactly what happened I do not know, but as he spoke, I heard, proceeding from the room, the sound of the buzzing of wings. Instantly it recalled my experiences of the night before. As it did so, I was conscious of a most unpleasant qualm. Sydney swore a great oath, as if he were beside himself with rage. If you won't go up, you shall come down. I suppose, failing to find a cord, he seized the blind from below and dragged it down. It came, roller and all, clattering to the floor. The room was all in light. I hurried in. Sydney was standing by the window, with a look of perplexity upon his face which, under any other circumstances, would have been comical. He was holding Papa's revolver in his hand, and was glaring round and round the room, as if wholly at a loss to understand how it was he did not see what he disn't. Marjorie, he exclaimed. Did you hear anything? Of course I did. It was that which I heard last night which so frightened me. Oh, was it? Then, in his excitement he must have been completely oblivious of my presence, for he used the most terrible language. When I find it, there'll be a small discussion. It can't have got out of the room. I know the creature's here. I not only heard it, I felt it brush against my face. Holt, come inside and shut that door. Mr. Holt raised his arms, as if he were exerting himself to make a forward movement, but he remained rooted to the spot on which he stood. I can't, he cried. You can't. Why? It won't let me. What won't let you? The Beetle. Sydney moved till he was close in front of him. He surveyed him with eager eyes. I was just at his back. I heard him murmur, possibly to me, By George. It's just as I thought. The beggar's hypnotized. Then he said aloud, Can you see it now? Yes. Where? Behind you. As Mr. Holt spoke, I again heard, quite close to me, that buzzing sound. Sydney seemed to hear it too. It caused him to swing round so quickly that he all but whirled me off my feet. I beg your pardon, Marjorie, but this is of the nature of an unparalleled experience. Didn't you hear something then? I did, distinctly. It was close to me, within an inch or two of my face. We stared about us, then back at each other. There was nothing else to be seen. Sydney laughed, doubtfully. It's uncommonly queer. I don't want to suggest that there are visions about, or I might suspect myself of softening of the brain. But it's queer. There's a trick about it somewhere, I am convinced, and no doubt it's simple enough when you know how it's done, but the difficulty is to find that out. Do you think our friend over there is acting? He looks to me as if he were ill. He does look ill. He also looks as if he were hypnotized. If he is, it must be by suggestion. And that's what makes me doubtful, because it will be the first plainly established case of hypnotism by suggestion I've encountered. Holt. Yes. That, said Sydney in my ear, is the voice, and that is the manner of a hypnotized man. But on the other hand, a person under influence generally responds only to the hypnotist, which is another feature about our peculiar friend which arouses my suspicions then. Aloud, don't stand there like an idiot, come inside. Again Mr. Holt made an apparently futile effort to do as he was bid. It was painful to look at him. He was like a feeble, frightened, tottering child, who would come on but cannot. I can't. No nonsense, my man. Do you think that this is a performance in a booth, and that I am to be taken in by all the humbug of a professional mesmerist? Do as I tell you. Come into the room. There was a repetition on Mr. Holt's part of his previous pitiful struggle. This time it was longer sustained than before, but the result was the same. I can't, he wailed. Then I say you can and shall. If I pick you up and carry you, perhaps you will not find yourself so helpless as you wish me to suppose." Sidney moved forward to put his threat into execution. As he did so, a strange alteration took place in Mr. Holt's demeanour. Chapter 30. The singular behaviour of Mr. Holt. I was standing in the middle of the room. Sidney was between the door and me. Mr. Holt was in the hall, just outside the doorway, in which he, so to speak, was framed. As Sidney advanced towards him, he was seized with a kind of convulsion. He had to lean against the side of the door to save himself from falling. Sidney paused and watched. The spasm went as suddenly as it came. Mr. Holt became as motionless as he had just now been the other way. He stood in an attitude of febrile expectancy, his chin raised, his head thrown back, his eyes glancing upwards, with the dreadful fixed glare which had come into them ever since we had entered the house. He looked to me as if his every faculty was strained in the act of listening. Not a muscle in his body seemed to move. He was as rigid as a figure carved in stone. Presently the rigidity gave place to what, to an onlooker, seemed causeless agitation. "I hear," he exclaimed, in the most curious voice I had ever heard. "I come." It was as though he was speaking to someone who was far away. Turning, he walked down the passage to the front door. "Hollo!" cried Sidney. "Where are you off to?" We both of us hastened to see. He was fumbling with the latch. Before we could reach him, the door was open, and he was through it. Sidney, rushing after him, caught him on the step and held him by the arm. "What's the meaning of this little caper? Where do you think you're going now?" Mr. Holt did not condescend to turn and look at him. He said, in the same dreamy, faraway, unnatural tone of voice, and he kept his unwavering gaze fixed on what was apparently some distant object which was visible only to himself. "I am going to him. He calls me." "Who calls you?" "The Lord of the Beetle." Whether Sidney released his arm or not, I cannot say. As he spoke, he seemed to me to slip away from Sidney's grasp. Passing through the gateway, turning to the right, he commenced to retrace his steps in the direction we had come. Sidney stared after him in unequivocal amazement. Then he looked at me. "Well, this is a pretty fix. Now what's to be done?" "What's the matter with him?" I inquired. "Is he mad?" "There's method in his madness if he is. He's in the same condition in which he was that night I saw him come out of the Apostle's window. Sidney has a horrible habit of calling Paul the Apostle. I have spoken to him about it over and over again, but my words have not made much impression. He ought to be followed. He may be sailing off to that mysterious friend of his this instant, but on the other hand, he mayn't. And it may be nothing but a trick of our friend the conjurer's to get us away from this elegant abode of his. He's done me twice already. I don't want to be done again, and I distinctly do not want him to return and find me missing. He's quite capable of taking the hint and removing himself into the Euchide, when the clue to as pretty a mystery as ever I came across will have vanished. "I can stay," I said. "You? Alone?" He eyed me doubtingly, evidently not altogether relishing the proposition. "Why not? You might send the first person you meet, policeman, cabman, or whoever it is, to keep me company. It seems a pity now that we dismissed that cab." "Yes, it does seem a pity." Sidney was biting his lip. "Confound that fellow. How fast he moves." Mr. Holt was already nearing the end of the road. "If you think it necessary, by all means follow to see where he goes. You are sure to meet somebody whom you will be able to send before you have gone very far." "I suppose I shall. You won't mind being left alone?" "Why should I? I'm not a child." Mr. Holt, reaching the corner, turned it, and vanished out of sight. Sidney gave an exclamation of impatience. "If I don't make haste, I shall lose him. I'll do as you suggest. Dispatch the first individual I come across to hold watch and ward with you." "That'll be all right." He started off at a run, shouting to me as he went. "It won't be 5 minutes before somebody comes." I waved my hand to him. I watched him till he reached the end of the road. Turning, he waved his hand to me. Then he vanished, as Mr. Holt had done, and I was alone. Chapter 31. The Terror by Day. My first impulse after Sidney's disappearance was to laugh. Why should he display anxiety on my behalf merely because I was to be the sole occupant of an otherwise empty house for a few minutes more or less, and in broad daylight too, to say the least? The anxiety seemed unwarranted. I lingered at the gate for a moment or two, wondering what was at the bottom of Mr. Holt's singular proceedings, and what Sidney really proposed to gain by acting as a spy upon his wanderings. Then I turned to re-enter the house. As I did so, another problem suggested itself to my mind. What connection, of the slightest importance could a man in Paul Lessingham's position have with the eccentric being who had established himself in such an unsatisfactory dwelling place? Mr. Holt's story I had only dimly understood. It struck me that it would require a deal of understanding. It was more like a farrago of nonsense, an outcome of delirium, than a plain statement of solid facts. To tell the truth, Sidney had taken it more seriously than I expected. He seemed to see something in it which I emphatically did not. What was double Dutch to me seemed clear as print to him. So far as I could judge, he actually had the presumption to imagine that Paul Lessingham, the great Paul Lessingham, was mixed up in the very mysterious adventures of poor, weak-minded, hysterical Mr. Holt, in a manner which was hardly to his credit. Of course, any idea of the kind was purely and simply balderdash. Exactly what Sidney had got in his bonnet I could not guess, but I did know Paul. Only let me find myself face to face with the fantastic author of Mr. Holt's weird tribulations, and I, a woman, single-handed, would do my best to show him that whoever played pranks with Paul Lessingham trifled with edge tools. I had returned to that historical front room which, according to Mr. Holt, had been the scene of his most disastrous burglarious entry. Whoever had furnished it had had original notions of the resources of modern upholstery. There was not a table in the place, no chair or couch, nothing to sit down upon except the bed. On the floor there was a marvellous carpet which was apparently of Eastern manufacture. It was so thick and so pliant to the tread that moving over it was like walking on 1,000-year-old turf. It was woven in gorgeous colours and covered with. When I discovered what it actually was covered with, I was conscious of a disagreeable sense of surprise. It was covered with beetles. All over it, with only a few inches of space between each, were representations of some peculiar kind of beetle. It was the same beetle, over and over and over. The artist had woven his undesirable subject into the warp and woof of the material with such cunning skill that, as one continued to gaze, one began to wonder if by any possibility the creatures could be alive. In spite of the softness of the texture, and the art of a kind which had been displayed in the workmanship, I rapidly arrived at the conclusion that it was the most uncomfortable carpet I had ever seen. I wagged my finger at the repeated portrayals of the to me unspeakable insect. If I had discovered that you were there before Sidney went, I think it just possible that I should have hesitated before I let him go. Then there came a revulsion of feeling. I shook myself. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Marjorie Linden, to even think such nonsense. Are you all nerves and morbid imaginings? You who have prided yourself on being so strong-minded, a pretty sort you are to do battle for anyone. Why, they're only make-believes. Half involuntarily, I drew my foot over one of the creatures. Of course, it was nothing but imagination, but I seemed to feel it squelch beneath my shoe. It was disgusting. Come, I cried. This won't do. As Sidney would phrase it, am I going to make an idiot of myself? I turned to the window, looking at my watch. It's more than 5 minutes ago since Sidney went. That companion of mine ought to be already on the way. I'll go and see if he is coming. I went to the gate. There was not a soul in sight. It was with such a distinct sense of disappointment that I perceived this was so, that I was in two minds what to do: to remain where I was, looking with gaping eyes for the policeman, or the cabman, or whoever it was Sidney was dispatching to act as my temporary associate, was tantamount to acknowledging myself a simpleton, while I was conscious of a most unmistakable reluctance to return within the house. Common sense, or what I took for common sense, however, triumphed, and, after loitering for another 5 minutes, I did go in again. This time, ignoring, to the best of my ability, the beetles on the floor, I proceeded to expend my curiosity and occupy my thoughts in an examination of the bed. It only needed a very cursory examination, however, to show that the seeming bed was, in reality, none at all, or if it was a bed after the manner of the Easterns, it certainly was not after the fashion of the Britons. There was no framework, nothing to represent the bedstead. It was simply a heap of rugs piled apparently indiscriminately upon the floor. A huge mass of them there seemed to be, of all sorts and shapes and sizes and materials too. The top one was of white silk, in quality, exquisite. It was of huge size, yet, with a little compression, one might almost have passed it through the proverbial wedding ring. So far as space admitted, I spread it out in front of me. In the middle was a picture. Whether it was embroidered on the substance or woven in it, I could not quite make out, nor at first could I gather what it was the artist had intended to depict. There was a brilliancy about it which was rather dazzling. By degrees, I realized that the lurid hues were meant for flames, and, when one had got so far, one perceived that they were by no means badly imitated either. Then the meaning of the thing dawned on me. It was a representation of a human sacrifice, in its way, as ghastly a piece of realism as one could see. On the right was the majestic seated figure of a goddess. Her hands were crossed upon her knees, and she was naked from her waist upwards. I fancied it was meant for Isis. On her brow was perched a gaily apparelled beetle, that ubiquitous beetle, forming a bright spot of colour against her coppery skin. It was an exact reproduction of the creatures which were imaged on the carpet. In front of the idol was an enormous fiery furnace. In the very heart of the flames was an altar. On the altar was a naked white woman being burned alive. There could be no doubt as to her being alive, for she was secured by chains in such a fashion that she was permitted a certain amount of freedom, of which she was availing herself to contort and twist her body into shapes which were horribly suggestive of the agony which she was enduring. The artist, indeed, seemed to have exhausted his powers in his efforts to convey a vivid impression of the pains which were tormenting her. A pretty picture, on my word. A pleasant taste in art the garnitures of this establishment suggest. The person who likes to live with this kind of thing, especially as a covering to his bed, must have his own notions as to what constitute agreeable surroundings. As I continued staring at the thing, all at once it seemed as if the woman on the altar moved. It was preposterous, but she appeared to gather her limbs together and turn half over. What can be the matter with me? Am I going mad? She can't be moving. If she wasn't, then certainly something was. She was lifted right into the air. An idea occurred to me. I snatched the rug aside. The mystery was explained. A thin, yellow, wrinkled hand was protruding from amidst the heap of rugs. It was its action which had caused the seeming movement of the figure on the altar. I stared, confounded. The hand was followed by an arm, the arm by a shoulder, the shoulder by a head, and the most awful, hideous, wicked-looking face I had ever pictured even in my most dreadful dreams. A pair of baleful eyes were glaring up at mine. I understood the position in a flash of startled amazement. Sidney, in following Mr. Holt, had started on a wild goose chase after all. I was alone with the occupant of that mysterious house, the chief actor in Mr. Holt's astounding tale. He had been hidden in the heap of rugs all the while.
This concludes the 7th part of 10 total of The Beetle by Richard Marsh, produced by Best Audio Books for free.